Welcome to the Patchwork podcast. My name is Brandon Robertson. Patchwork is a show that brings together various voices and perspectives on the topics of spirituality, social renewal, and culture to help you expand your mind and tap into a richer, fuller life. To start, let me introduce myself. For as long as I can remember, I've had a passion for bringing together diverse people and perspectives. Today, I'm an author, a pastor, and a consultant to faith communities, governments, and nonprofit organizations around the world, helping them build bridges and create understanding in the midst of diversity. This podcast is an extension of that work and that passion. In every episode, we'll dive deep into a topic with an expert in the field and see if we can get a better understanding. You might agree with what's said, and you might disagree. But whatever the case, I invite you to lean in and listen deeply, because I assure you that you'll find something worth grabbing onto in every conversation. As with all things done in public, your support means the world to me. So if you find today's conversation compelling, please tweet, post, like, share with all of your friends on social media using the hashtag Patchwork. And your feedback really does make every episode of this podcast better. So if you have time, please consider heading over to iTunes and leaving a review. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for tuning in. Let's dive into today's conversation. For most of the world, evolution is a fact. Most scientists, most kids taught in school are told that evolution is the way that the world has been created, that Darwin's theory of evolution in particular is the mechanism through which the modern world that we live in with all of the evolved species, including humanity, this is how it's manifest through Darwin's theory of evolution. But there is a minority group within our country and within academia that has always been asking questions about Darwin's theory of evolution. Is it actually the best process, the best way to understand how the world has come to be the way that it is today? Or is there another way? Is the wisdom of the ancient traditions that said there perhaps was an intelligent designer a more holistic and accurate way to understand the evolution of our species and of the world? This minority group is often critiqued and criticized both by progressive religious institutions, but also by the scientific world and academia. And today, we get the opportunity to talk to one of the most criticized voices in this conversation on intelligent design versus Darwin's theory of evolution. His name is Dr. Michael Behe, and he has written a new book called Darwin Devolves that the New York Times says is near heresy. I'm sitting down with Dr. Behe today, in full disclosure, as somebody who does believe in Darwin's theory of evolution, who has kind of moved on past creationism, which is an ideology that I once embraced and advocated for, which believed that God literally made the world in 6 literal days, as it's written in Genesis chapter 1, 2, and 3 in the Bible. And yet, I also still hold this tension of believing in Darwin's theory of evolution because it does seem to be the scientifically robust and generally accepted truth, but also believing in an intelligent designer, looking at the world, believing that this grand intelligence I know as God is the creative force in the world that has made all of these complex and beautiful realities that we get to experience. So that's a tension I've lived in. And Dr. Michael Behe, as you'll hear, rejects creationism as valid science, but he is a strong advocate for questioning and being skeptical of Darwinian evolution, and also for advocating different ways of understanding how evolution has worked as a process, using intelligent design as a springboard. And so this conversation is a chance for those of us who, I imagine most of us listening, probably take evolution for granted. This is an opportunity for us to lean in and listen to a different perspective. Again, many people have critiqued Dr. Michael Behe's perspective on evolution and on intelligent design. Many people have really marginalized this way of seeing the biological evolution of our world. And yet, on this podcast, we're all about leaning in and listening to different perspectives. And no matter where you stand or what conclusion you come to, I think that by the end of my conversation today, I hope that you'll at least begin to understand that it's important to continue to walk through this world with a skeptical mind, with a critical mind, and with an open mind. Whenever we're certain of something, in my experience, we can be sure that we are not at the truth, because we're finite human beings and the knowledge of this world is infinite. And so I think the call and the posture that I walked away from my interview with Dr. Behe is towards humility, towards curiosity, and towards skepticism. Again, this is one of these interviews where I agree and disagree quite a bit with the guest, and yet I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have had this conversation, and I really think it will be beneficial to you if you're at all interested in the conversation about how humanity got to where we are today, how our world got to where it is today. Is Darwinian evolution the end-all be-all scientific theory that we should embrace, or are there other legitimate ways to think about this? That's the conversation I have today with Dr. Michael Behe, and I'm really excited for you to listen in. So without further ado, here is my conversation with Dr. Michael Behe. So kind of just to jump in, I want to ask, who are you and how did you get into this world? You're at this intersection of Christian faith and science and intelligent design, and you've been pretty prolific in writing and speaking and teaching about this. How does one end up in this unique field and this unique conversation offering what you do to the world?
Well, I guess it's amazing coincidences. I didn't start out looking for a fight or anything like that. I'm Christian. I'm a Roman Catholic. Went to parochial schools. Was taught that God could make the world, make life any way He wanted to, and if He wants to do it by natural processes exclusively, well, that's up to Him, not to me. And I always was satisfied with that. And but I was interested in science, so I went and got a PhD in biochemistry. And of course, biochemistry studies the molecular basis of life. And looking back, I never saw anybody explaining how these really crazy, complicated systems that biochemistry studies could have evolved by a Darwinian process. But I didn't think about it much for the first part of my career. It was only after reading a book called Evolution: A Theory in Crisis by an Australian biochemist by the name of Michael Denton did I kind of get shocked out of my complacency. He listed a number of problems for the dominant theory, for Darwin's theory, that I had never heard of. And at the time, I was a tenured associate professor here at Lehigh University. And I kind of got ticked off because I came to the conclusion that I was being led to believe something, not because there was compelling evidence for it, but rather just because that's the way we modern folks are supposed to think these days. And from then on, that marks the time when I got interested in the topic of evolution. That was not my focus before. And since then, that was in the late 80s, a while back, I met some like-minded people, and kind of serendipitously, I got the idea to write a book. Scientists don't usually write books. We don't even read them. We read papers. But I got the idea to write a book from somebody outside of science. And that was my first book, Darwin's Black Box, in '96. And I've been kind of fighting on the same question so since then for over 20 years.
Wow. Totally. It sounds like, I mean, like you said, it is quite a winding journey. And I think what's really compelling to me is that you're both a strong person of faith and also pretty deeply committed to science. And kind of, I want to take it back to the very beginning and say the foundational aspect of what you believe and who you are in the world. When you talk about God, how is it that you conceive of God, and how does science and your study of intelligent design and evolution, how does that influence how you see and perceive God?
Well, of course, I was raised in the Catholic faith, and so I saw God in the teachings of the church and so on. And but outside of explicit teachings, I've always thought that the ability of people to think, to be rational, to be conscious, and so on, pointed strongly to something beyond just the material world. So it was, for me, it was always the ability to think that pointed strongly to the supernatural, to God. But in science, uh, you have to realize that we people are mixes of physical beings and rational beings, and the only reason we can do science is because we're rational. And one of our rational faculties, besides doing experiments and so on, is to discern when things are arranged for a purpose. For example, if you see flowers arranged in a flower garden instead of just scattered wildly, or if you see parts arranged to make a machine, like say a mousetrap, we rational people can see that there is a mind behind those arrangements, because we know that a mind can have a purpose and can, to the extent of its ability to manipulate things, can take different parts and put them in relationship to each other in order to fulfill some goal, to fulfill some purpose. And after I kind of got knocked off my feet concerning Darwinism, I started to look at biochemistry that way. And for folks who haven't studied it much, biochemistry has discovered and studies profoundly purposeful, complex, elegant systems at the very foundation of life, the molecular and cellular foundation of life. There are pieces that fit together to do all manner of things, like build stuff and regulate stuff and process information that we humans can't do even today. And so when you see that, if you're Christian or if you're Jewish, you can think back to the psalm that I praise you because I am fearfully and wonderfully made. And you can think to yourself, well, the psalmist didn't know the half of it. Now that science has progressed and we've discovered the foundation of life that nobody in the world knew before us, before, say, the last 50 years or so, you can see that we're beyond fearfully and wonderfully made. There's enormous detail, enormous sophistication, enormous elegance that goes into making people, along with everything else in the biosphere. So that's what strikes me as a Christian.
Totally. That's a beautiful articulation. And it's very important, as you've written about and are speaking about, I think, for Christians to kind of wake up and to delve into the riches of science as a means of revelation of who God is, and of how our faith can adapt and change and transform and also inform the way that we interact and move in this modern world. And so you wrote Darwin's Black Box, and that was a pretty seminal book. It caused a lot of conversation, a lot of pushback, as you've talked about. And you have this new book out, Darwin Devolves. What's the different message that you're trying to communicate in this book, and what is the big idea that you would want people to take away as they interact with Darwin Devolves?
Well, it's kind of a flip side of Darwin's Black Box. In Darwin's Black Box, I just kind of described some of the really impressive systems that science has discovered in the cell at the molecular basis of life: the blood clotting system, an outward motor called the bacterial flagellum that allows bacteria to swim, which consists of all these mechanical parts, a rotor, a motor, a stator, and all sorts of other parts that we immediately recognize as designed in our everyday world, or would if it were in our if it were visible to us. And I argued that those things were beyond Darwinian evolution, because Darwinian evolution says that things have to evolve slowly in tiny steps, because if they evolved quickly in large leaps, it would look certainly as if there was something other than chance involved. So Darwin himself always insisted that his theory had to work gradually. But many of these machines are what I termed irreducibly complex. And that just means that they have a number of parts, and if one or more of the parts is missing, then they're broken. And I illustrated this in the book with a mousetrap. The mousetrap's got a spring and a hammer and other parts. And if you take one away, it doesn't work at all. So if you think about trying to make a mousetrap gradually by numerous successive slight modifications, as Darwin writes in The Origin of Species, it's real hard to do. And in the 20 plus years since I wrote that book, nobody has done it. Mm. But science marches on, and people should realize that in the past just 20 years, since the turn of the millennium, our view of evolution has been revolutionized perhaps as much as, think back to astronomy before the invention of the telescope and after the invention of the telescope, or biology before the invention of a microscope and afterwards. Improvements in technology have profoundly increased our ability to look at the mechanism of evolution. You know that the mechanism of evolution is, well, there are mutations, and some mutations might help an organism survive. And so those organisms, those lucky organisms, go on to produce more offspring because they live longer. And those offspring can, if they inherit the mutation, can live longer than their peers, and eventually it spreads throughout the whole population. And scientists could see examples of that. They could see some organisms, new ones, which would show up occasionally and do better in an environment, but they could never tell, or rarely could tell, what the mutation was that was causing the change. And that's because mutations are changes in molecules, in DNA, and in the proteins that it codes for. And our ability to look at the molecular level was really very limited until around the year 2000, when new equipment was invented specifically for that purpose. And now we can sequence DNA and sequence entire genomes, like falling off a log. And the take-home lesson of Darwin Devolves is that the great majority of those helpful, beneficial mutations that science has discovered turn out to be ones that break or degrade pre-existing genes. And that is that Darwin's mechanism works mostly by devolution rather than evolution. You throw things away instead of make new things. And people often wonder, how can you improve by throwing something away or breaking something? And I write in the book of an analogy that, suppose your life depended on your car getting a little bit better gas mileage. What could you do to immediately get better gas mileage? Well, one thing you could do is, remove the weight of the car. You could throw away the spare tire, or the back seat, or the doors even. Those are useful in many circumstances, but if your life depended on your car getting better gas mileage right now, then that would be the way to go. And so it turns out adapting quickly can oftentimes mean throwing something away. And I begin the book by talking about the example of the polar bear, which is supposed to be descended from a brown bear a couple 100,000 years ago. And one of the most highly selected mutations that has spread through the polar bear population is one where a gene that's involved in making the colored coat pigment, the brown pigment of the brown bear's coat, is broken. And so it can't make the pigment anymore, and its fur is white. That helps it. It helps it in the Arctic environment, but it's helping by getting rid of something that was already there. And then, of course, the take-home lesson is that a mechanism like Darwin's that works mainly by breaking things that were already there is not the explanation for how these sophisticated machines got into existence in the first place.
Well, it seems to make a lot of sense as you explain it, and yet, as you've already said, some of the reviews of the book, like the New York Times, said it that this work is close to heretical from a scientific position. Why is there such resistance from kind of the mainstream scientific community to your position here, especially if it seems so self-evident?
Yeah, that's a great question, and you can think of a number of reasons. Not all of them. I don't think any of them are good reasons, but mostly historical and philosophical, not so much scientific reasons. The historical reason, I think, is that in the Middle Ages and Renaissance and around that time, physics and chemistry were developing as real sciences. They could study things, they could explain things, but biology, it could study things and so on, but it could never explain where these creatures came from. And it kind of set up, a physics envy in biologists. Why can't we explain everything about our topic too? And when Darwin came along, he proposed a mechanism whereby he argued, life could develop simply by natural processes akin to those of physics and chemistry. And so biology could be a real science, just like the big boys. It's interesting to note that when Darwin proposed his theory, that most biologists didn't think his mechanism would actually work. He and one or two others, but most of the prominent biologists of that time didn't think his mechanism would work. Nonetheless, everybody enthusiastically jumped on the boat thinking that, well, if Darwin's mechanism doesn't work, at least we can think of some other mechanism. And now biology, we will declare that biology is fully within science, and we have to explain it by some mechanism such as chemistry and physics uses. And of course, there's been bad blood too between biology and anything that smacks of religion ever since Darwin's book too, because philosophy and religion always thought that it was evident that life was designed, and mostly because of the reason that I explained earlier, the purposeful arrangement of parts. You can see the eyeball has all these parts that are, really elegantly arranged for sight, and all other organisms as well. And so there was bad blood between the two, and that came to a head in several different times and places, perhaps most famously the Scopes trial. And so whenever you suggest anything that kind of smacks of the need for something outside of brute nature to be responsible for life, then that automatically gets you on the bad side of a lot of history.
Totally. Yeah. And kind of speaking of that, you talk about, so you're in the Roman Catholic tradition, and the Roman Catholic tradition and the broader Christian tradition has had this, at least for some time in certain periods, this tension and resistance to scientific innovation. How would you respond to people that would say that you're just allowing your religious convictions or the convictions of the Roman Catholic Church to influence and prevent you from jumping on the scientific mainstream line of thought?
When I give talks on this subject, I show a slide, and the slide is a cartoon, a Far Side cartoon. If you're familiar with Far Side, I love that. And a guy named Gary Larson was the artist, and this is one where there is a troop of jungle explorers walking through a jungle, and the lead explorer is drawn dangling from an ankle upside down by a vine that's pulled him up, and these bamboo poles have come out and skewered him. Now he's walked into a trap. And then there's a funny line, which I won't bother about, but I show this to people and I say, you look at this and you immediately realize that this trap was designed. It wasn't an accident. And it's not a religious conclusion to decide that in fact it was designed, because we see a purposeful arrangement of parts. We see the bamboo, the vine all ordered to each other so that they can perform this function. So it turns out that recognizing design is something we humans do all the time because we have minds. We're not just automatons, and we can recognize purpose. And it's clear from the physical evidence. It's not a religious conclusion to think that the jungle explorer was caught in a trap that was intentionally set. It's an ordinary conclusion based on physical empirical data, that is the structure of the trap, plus our appreciation for how we come to a conclusion of intelligent design. And that's when we perceive a purposeful arrangement of parts. And you can further say that, this idea of design, although it's often conflated with creationism, and people think it's a recent idea. Of course, it goes all the way back to the ancient Greeks. Whenever the first philosophers started to write about life and nature, design was immediately evident to pretty much everybody, because they could see how the world and life was arranged for various purposes. So yeah, that is an objection that a lot of people immediately think of. They say, well, you're a religious person, therefore your conclusion of design is a religious one, but that's not the case. And as I said earlier, I am a religious person, but I had thought for the longest time that Darwin's theory could explain things, but it's only when I looked critically at the theory that I've turned towards design.
Totally. And kind of going in the same direction, you brought up creationism, and you've been involved in a few legal proceedings about whether, and it might be a conflation, so clarify this if I'm wrong here, but there's been some fights to have creationism have an equal footing in the classroom in some parts of our country. And I believe from what I've read that you've helped advocate at least for that, to have that theory to have equal grounding in textbooks and classrooms. Is what you're advocating for, is intelligent design the way you're talking about it, is that the same thing as creationism? And if not, what would you say the differences are?
Well, great question. And no, intelligent design is not creationism. I like to say intelligent or creationism is to intelligent design as the book of Genesis is to the Big Bang Theory. In Genesis, it says, in the beginning, God created, and that implies a beginning to everything, to all of nature. And the Big Bang Theory says, looks like the universe started, a finite time ago, and it wasn't always in existence. So they both say that it looks like nature had a beginning, but Genesis does so on religious authority, and the Big Bang Theory does so by looking at physical data from motions of stars and galaxies and so on. Same way with creationism and intelligent design. In my mind, creationism says, well, look, the Bible says God created everything according to its kind, and God made things, and therefore, life was purposely designed. And that's fine, but intelligent design theory says, look at the structures of the physical systems that have been discovered in life, especially the ones that have been discovered in the past 70 years or so, DNA, molecular machines, and so on. These are extraordinarily elegant. They have many parts that work together. We always recognize a purposeful design in an arrangement of parts to do some function. We see it, in extraordinary measure in life. We have no other explanation for this, Darwinian pretensions notwithstanding, and therefore we conclude from the physical evidence plus ordinary logic and reasoning that, in fact, this is the case. So intelligent design comes to a similar conclusion, perhaps, to creationists, but it does so starting from a different point, from different evidence, from scientific evidence. And it's interesting, I was involved in a couple of legal tiffs, and from that experience, I recommend that you avoid it if at all possible. But I get mad because most scientists know that we haven't a clue how much of biology developed. We're utterly clueless about the origin of life. Many, many things, even if some scientists think that Darwinism will explain the basis of life, it's clear that we don't have that explanation right now. And yet they're telling school children that we do know, that it's certain that we know, and that this is the only way to think about life. And that, in my mind, is misleading children for ideological reasons. So in my book, it's propaganda more than it is teaching. That's why I advocate for at least letting kids know about the problems with Darwin's theory.
And just to clarify, should creationism have equal footing in an academic setting, or would you say intelligent design should, or would you say both? How would you think about that just from where you sit in the world?
Okay. Well, in my mind, creationism should not, because it is a religious idea. Intelligent design, I think, certainly could be mentioned, or even should be mentioned in my own view. And most importantly, I think that students should be given the straight facts that science is, we made some progress, but we don't have many answers. Even if you're a Darwinist, you have to admit we don't have many answers. There are things that are totally unknown. And so kids should not be led to think that science will explain it all for you.
Totally. So it sounds like essentially beyond your scientific work in the world, the thing that you're actually advocating for is that we keep an open mind, we keep a critical mind as we engage with science, as we engage with facts, as we think about the origins of life and the origins of our universe. If we have intellectual honesty and openness, it sounds like you believe we can come to more fascinating and more accurate conclusions. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yeah, that's exactly right. If that's the problem with an idea getting kind of calcified in the 19th century and exerting its grip all the way into the 21st century, is that science is making wonderful it's making wonderful progress in finding out how life is organized, how it's run, and it's astonishingly cool. It's really impressive, but it's inhibited by the fact that everything has to be stuffed into this 19th century idea of Darwinian evolution by utter chance and selection. And so we kind of put blinders on, and an idea such as I write about, which is not hard to see, it's really very simple. Nonetheless, many scientists, many smart people, run away screaming. They don't want to even listen to this, let alone entertain it as a serious consideration.
Totally. Well, I appreciate you being willing to talk and to share this in such tumultuous times for somebody like you to be standing up. I know it takes courage, and I know you've taken hits for standing for what you think is right. And it sounds like a very compelling position that I hope all of our listeners will at least give a chance, give your perspective on this a hearing, because that sounds like the heart of what scientific inquiry is all about. It's that curiosity, that humility, that wonder as we engage with the complexity of the universe. So I really thank you for taking some time to chat with us and for writing these books, Darwin Devolves and Darwin's Black Box.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure talking with you, and it's been a lot of fun. The whole ride has been, because who wants to be an academic and trying to discover the truth and have people tell you that no, you can't look over in this direction, because that's off limits.
Totally. And where can people find out more information about you and your work?
Well, they can look up the website of my new book, which is called Darwin Devolves, and the website is just www.darwindevolves.com, and you can order it there, or it will direct you to Amazon where you can order it. And if people are interested, the website also contains all of the blistering criticism in the reviews that has greeted this book, and my replies to that criticism. So if you want to read about the nitty-gritty, that's the place to go.
Yeah. Well, as somebody who's gotten the charge of heresy in my own life a number of times, it's quite an honorable thing to have the New York Times saying you're nearing on heresy. So good job.
Thank you.
I hope you found today's conversation challenging and inspiring. It's through listening in and learning from others who see the world differently than us, which, by the way, means absolutely everyone, because no two people share the same vantage point. That's how we grow and expand. If you did enjoy today's podcast, please share it with your friends on social media. And when you do, don't forget to use the hashtag Patchwork. We really appreciate it. Thank you again for spending time with us today. Until next time, peace be with you.